return to the topic of ethical intuitionism, and this time talk about the aspect of intuitionism which seems largely independent of the thought that the best we can do in ethics is come up with general principles that hold only all other things being equal, because there are different things that we care about. They come into conflict with each other, the world is complicated, we don't have any universal rules about how to resolve those conflicts or reach those compromises or balances, and in general decide what to do. Well, this view instead is older in the philosophical tradition. It goes back to the early modern period, and it's something that is popular among some contemporary psychologists who think that the whole picture that philosophers have developed of morality is really misleading. Philosophers like to think that often we're misled by either traditional things that amount to little more than superstitions, or maybe prejudices of various kinds, or they think that we become too emotionally involved in things, and that the best thing we can do in ethics is get rid of all of that. The whole affective element, the effect of emotion, and all of the things that are beside reason, and as it's a focus on reason. And then there are different approaches, of course. The Kantian will say, the right action is ultimately the rational action. I should act as other rational agents would have me act, in the sense that I should act only on maxims that I would be willing to universalize as applying to all rational agents. In other words, have them act exactly on the same maxim. And so I should treat all rational agents, including myself, with respect. A utilitarian or some other consequentialist, on the other hand, will say, I want to produce as much good as possible, and it's a rationally discoverable matter. What will, in fact, promote the most good? So what I need to do is something like a complex calculation. Maybe it's done quantitatively, which is the utilitarian ideal. Maybe it's more qualitative matter, as other consequentialists might think. But whatever it is, there is a rational process by which I can determine what I should do. The ethical intuitionist in this older sense, and I will use today the more contemporary term social intuitionism for this view. That's what contemporary psychologists such as Jonathan Haidt call it. It's really a view that says that picture of morality as rationality raised to the level of norms is the wrong picture. That's not what's going on in morality. Or maybe more precisely, it's only part of, and it's secondary part of, what's going on in morality. Morality is primarily driven by something else. So here is the overall view. There are really two things going on in moral thinking. There is the rational part, there is reason, but there is also something else. So something else we could call intuition. And so the picture really goes something like this. It is intuition that is primary. When we're faced with a moral situation, or we make a moral judgment, the first thing that happens is we have an intuition about it. That is primarily an affective response. It's primarily an emotional response. It correlates much more closely with emotional reactions than it does with any rational conclusions. It's very rapid. It happens very, very quickly before we really have time to mobilize reason and think about things, categorize things, and so on. We look at it and immediately we have a sense. That's good. That's bad. That's right. That's wrong. So we have an intuition which is largely emotional. Maybe not entirely. This is a form of social intuitionism, so it may well be that this is in part a reaction to social conditioning. It may be in part something that is shaped by our own prior reasoning, but nevertheless it is largely affective. Well, that comes first. Then we make a moral judgment on the basis of how we feel about this. And only then do we engage in reasoning to try to supply reasons why that's the judgment we've come up with. So we don't formulate our judgments on the basis of reasoning. Instead, the reasoning is ex post facto. It happens after the judgment. It is a way of trying to be cynical about it, rationalize the judgment, give reasons for the judgment that was reached on independent grounds. We had a feeling, we had this emotional reaction, we had an intuition. And some philosophers on the contemporary scene think of these intuitions not as primarily emotional or affective, but as in some sense rational. They refer to them as intellectual seemings. They often have that in mind for intuitions about other kinds of cases. but it could apply to moral cases too. So this might be itself an intellectual process. Maybe they are intellectual seemings. It seems wrong to me, it seems right. But more frequently, and what it really correlates with, is emotional reaction. I respond with a positive emotion or a negative emotion. Now there can be different forms of emotion that get mobilized here. I may respond emotionally to different kinds of things that are good, to different kinds of things that are bad in different ways. And so it's not as if there's one good emotion, one bad emotion. There are lots of emotions that have a kind of positive character to them, and a lot of them have a negative valence to them. And those are going to issue forth in various kinds of moral judgments. Often the kind of judgment specifically will be based on what that emotional reaction is, what exactly the form of the affect is. But I'm going to judge them that that's wrong, and it's going to happen very, very quickly before I even have a chance to reason. Moreover, sometimes I do this really before reasoning is mobilized at all. Before, that is to say, I even think about things, and once I start thinking about them, I realize I don't have a reason. Haidt and his collaborators are fond of cases that involve taboos, and they carefully craft these cases so that part of the story is that, well, all those things that might be relevant rational considerations are not present. He builds the case in such a way that all the things you might be thinking, well, it's wrong for this reason or wrong for that reason, they're not part of the case. And then he asks people, what do you think of that? Almost everyone says immediately, that's wrong. But now, why? People struggle to find a reason. They might propose a reason. He says, well, remember in the case, all of these things have been built in such a way that none of those rational considerations apply. And once people have gone through the process, they say, well, I don't know why, but it's still wrong. In other words, Haidt's point isn't just that we have a very quick way of judging, and then we check it with reasoning to make sure we're on the right track. Even when all the reasons we might give in favor for it don't apply in this case, we stick with our judgment. We do not revise it on the basis of reasoning. It's emotion that's in the driver's seat. Reason is along for the ride. And when reason disagrees that this is the right path, sorry, the driver still determines which way we should go. So, not only does reasoning take place afterwards, it's usually ineffectual. It's usually nothing more than a justification for the judgment already reached. It very rarely actually leads us to revise the judgment or change it. Now, taboo cases are somewhat extreme. So, it's important to evaluate this in other kinds of cases as well. And Haidt and his collaborators have done that. They found that we in effect have two systems of thinking about moral questions, about normative questions more generally. We have what's often referred to in the literature as System 1. System 1 is this kind of intuitive, emotional response. We've come to judgments very, very quickly, within a few milliseconds, about whether something is just or unjust, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's good or bad. And only later, and in a much slower process, called System 2, do we actually engage in reasoning. Now, why do we engage in System 2 at all? It looks like it's some sort of, fifth wheel. If this is the thing that's really doing all the work, why have such a system? Well, there are several things that make it valuable. So, first of all, let's think about the characteristics of these systems. This one is very fast. We have a snap judgment. It's almost immediate. We're not aware of any conscious reasoning, though presumably something's happening in the brain that leads to this. It happens extremely quickly. System 2, in contrast, is rather slow. What else is true of these systems? Well, System 1 is fast. It's largely shared. It is something that doesn't really require any work. It's something like automatic. We get these immediate emotional reactions whether we want to or not. Somebody can go in and say, keep a neutral mind, and then something happens, or they hear one of Haidt's stories, they immediately form a reaction. It is something that seems automatic. We don't have to work at it. We don't exert energy. It's there. System 2, on the other hand, that's kind of hard. We have to work on it. It takes energy, it takes effort. There are some other respects in which we can compare these two systems. The intuitive system that is based on emotion, and then the reasoning system. One thing to say about them is that this system, 1, fast, shared, automatic, where we have these quick emotional responses to things, well, that does have certain advantages in that it is private. It doesn't require working with others. It doesn't involve convincing anyone else. It doesn't involve anything else. It seems like that conflicts with my shared idea, but the fact is it's something that happens purely within me. I can do it all by myself. In fact, I do it all by myself. I don't have to sort of learn how to do it from others or share this with others in any way. Whereas, on the other hand, System 2 is, maybe not always, but often public. It's something that is a shared moral discourse. I have to learn how to participate in that discourse. I have to learn what people take to be an acceptable reason, what counts as a justification, what might count as an acceptable moral argument in favor of doing something. And so that is also a respect in which it might take some work. Well, there are other differences we could point to. For example, this one is purely natural. That's part of what I mean by automatic. This one is something that is not. This one is spontaneous. It just springs from me whether I like it or not. But this is anything but spontaneous. It is something that requires some degree of preparation. But then you might say, well, look, I was wondering already why we need this fifth wheel of reasoning if actually what's driving us in terms of norms is entirely this first system. Looks like it's better, right? It's fast, it's automatic, it's spontaneous, doesn't take any work. This one's slow. People tend to take different starting points and accept different forms of argument. I've got to learn to do it. It requires some preparation and learning. It takes effort. So why would I ever do this? Well, there are two reasons why I might do that. First of all, the question is this really reliable? Sometimes my emotional reactions are things I do think are highly reliable. And I trust them, and I don't go back and revise them after thinking more seriously about it. In fact, if you craft the case in such a way that all my reasons don't apply, I tend to stick with my judgment and say, still, despite all of that, I think no matter what you say, no matter what reasons you give me and so on, still, I think it's wrong. But sometimes I change them. Sometimes I say, well, that's a good point. I think I was hasty. Sometimes I say, you might be right. That was really based on a preconception here, a sort of prejudice I had. I should rethink this, because I'm not necessarily facing the same kind of situation now. There are times when I go back and I say, I think I had too much at stake personally, and my own personal feelings and personal interests entered too much into that. Actually, although I come out at a disadvantage as a result, that's the right thing to do. So in short, I tend to look at System 2 and say, it is a very useful check. In other words, I tend to think it's more reliable. Now again, I'm going to put a question mark there, because the degree of reliability of these two is rather tricky. It might be, on one conception that stresses the importance of System 2, that here, yes, I have these good moral intuitions, the trustworthy ones, but I also have all sorts of other intuitive responses based on self-interest, or prejudice, or superstition, or various other kinds of considerations that don't really deserve any moral respect. That would lead me to think this system is going to be a lot more reliable. But I might also think, I kind of trust this. We've evolved in such a way that we've had these emotional reactions, and it's the product of evolution over millennia. As human beings were formed, as they responded to things, and some of those responses worked out well, and some of them didn't work out well, we've got hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years of evolution behind this model. What do we have over here? Well, people have been doing consequentialist calculations roughly since 1789. That seems like a lot less history behind this kind of system. And so you might worry that, wait a minute, I don't know which is more reliable. George Orwell famously said, only an intellectual could believe this. No common person could be such a fool. And sometimes we think that. We think, there might be an elaborate chain of reasoning that leads you to this conclusion. But man, I feel intuitively that's just wrong. And no matter how long you give me to listen to your theories and hear your arguments and come up with the deductions and look at your decision procedure and so on that tells you this is the right thing to do, I'm going to say no. I'm sorry, I don't care how you try to justify it. It is wrong. You would have to be in the grip of a theory to think so. So we certainly shouldn't think this is completely reliable. And maybe, in some settings at least, and with respect to some kinds of issues, it's really less reliable. So there are important issues there. Well, if we're not sure about that, why would, again, we ever resort to this? There are several different kinds of considerations. Why, you might say, do we ever go to this system? Here's reason one. There is disagreement. You have one moral reaction, I have a different moral reaction. What do we do about that? Do we just fight it out? If it's really just emotional, you might say there's nothing to do but fight it out, or yell insults at each other. It's just combat now, it's just a conflict, there's no resolution that's rational. But we might think, well, wait a minute. Maybe one of us is right that this is an injustice. Maybe the other is right that it's fair. We better think about what justice is. And if you think about Plato's early dialogues, where he discusses questions like what is virtue, what is courage, what is piety, and so on, it's often a case where there's disagreement like that. Euthyphro shows up at the court prosecuting his own father, and his own family deplores this and says, no, that's not at all the right thing to do. You're being a terrible son and a terrible member of the family. Wrong thing to do. Well, there's that kind of disagreement that starts the conversation. So we appeal to system 2 when we disagree. Another thing is sometimes we're trying to persuade. I'm talking about this in election season in the United States. Plenty of people are out there trying to persuade other people to see things as they see them. They don't, well, sadly they often do just sort of spout emotional reactions toward each other. But ideally they say, well, look, I don't want to just give my own emotional reaction. I want to try to convince you that what I'm saying is right. I want to try to convince you that this is a serious social problem, or that this would be a much better way of doing things, or that that would be a much worse way of doing things. And I need reasons for that. I'm not going to persuade you by just shouting and jumping up and down and being louder and louder about my intuitive reaction. I got to give you reasons. And reasons involve system 2. Another reason is sometimes we criticize people's views, including our own views. That sort of criticism can be important. Aristotle said the job of the teacher is to teach the student to like and dislike what he ought. In other words, to serve as a kind of critic on somebody else's emotional reactions. Aristotle would admit, look, a lot of things end up coming down to these intuitive, these emotional, affective responses. But they can be trained to become more reliable. They are just a given. It's not just that we have these passions, and as that word suggests, we're just passive, and these outside forces sweep over us and make us say, that's not fair, or whatever. No, these are intuitive reactions that are the product of our earlier experiences. Some of them may strike us with this kind of force as if coming from outside, but they can be shaped, they can be trained, we can make them better. And St. Augustine talked about the ordo amoris, the order of loves or the order of affections, getting our affective responses in order in such a way that they respond appropriately to the world. When there's something good in the world, I should have a positive feeling about it. When there's something bad, I should have a negative feeling about it. When I do, then my affective responses, my emotions, my intuitions are in order. They're in order with the world. They're congruous with the world. But they can also be incongruous with the nature of things. I might be getting angry at the wrong things. I might be admiring the wrong things. And in that case, I've got to get myself in order. Well, that means I need to criticize my own intuitive responses. Of course, it's hard to do with respect to yourself, much easier to do with respect to other people, saying, yeah, I know your intuition is telling you this. I know that's your intuitive response. You're wrong. And so sometimes we need to criticize other people. Well, there are a couple of other reasons. Sometimes we need to give a justification. Sometimes we need to, well, justify things to ourselves, that to be sure that's the right thing to do. If we're not certain, we have this response, but we're not sure it's right. Sometimes we want to justify something to other people who start to criticize us or who disagree. And so there is a task here of justification. Sometimes I'm asked to give reasons. Well, why do you think so? And I have to come up with reasons. I can't just say, sorry, I think so, that's the end of the story. I have to try, well, not necessarily try to persuade, but at the very least try to explain why there are reasons for seeing it this way. Finally, there may be situations where we have to reach a collective decision. We have to come to some kind of common agreement. And when we come to a common collective decision about what we will do, well, then my own emotional reactions aren't necessarily going to be a good guide. We have to figure out somehow what we are going to do together. We might all share the same emotional reaction, maybe it'll be easy. We might not. And so when we don't, what do? Now, in part, this is this question of disagreement. But in this case, I'm not necessarily interested in persuading you or criticizing you or justifying my own position. The thing is, okay, we have somewhat different responses to this. What are we going to do about that? Maybe it's a group of people in a company trying to hire someone, and their intuitive responses to the candidates are different. Somebody said, well, I really liked candidate A. Somebody said, well, yeah, that candidate was pretty good, but man, I thought B was super impressive. And other people go around the table and there are differing opinions, right? Now, some of that is based on reasons, but a lot of it is driven by that immediate reaction. People say that within a job interview, you can tell within the first 30 seconds whether this is somebody you actually think is a serious contender for the job. It often doesn't take long. In academia, we often have something like 45-minute to an hour-long interviews, but probably most people have reached their conclusions, not necessarily in detail, but the basic, contender or not a contender within the first few seconds. So, there is a problem then. If our reactions are slightly different, somewhat different, even if they're not in sharp disagreement, how do we decide together? What do? We have to give reasons. The decision-making collectively is going to take place over here. It's not going to take place over here, at least if we're a well-functioning group. Maybe if we're over here and we're in trouble, there is nothing to do with punch it out or shout at each other or argue in the negative way, not presenting reasons and arguments in the logical sense, but just yelling at each other. Well, all of those are reasons why we might go to system 2. Now, ethical intuitionism in this sense is really the claim that this is primary. But it doesn't necessarily deny that reason plays a role. Partly, it plays a role in resolving disagreements, in persuading, in criticizing, in justifying, and in reaching collective decisions. Partly, it is an important check on reliability. But I think there's a broader thing that the social intuitionists don't always emphasize, but that more traditional intuitionists did. There is a feedback loop here. And so we engage in a process of self-criticism, checking this with reasoning, and that feedback loop leads us to refine our intuitions. So, as Aristotle, or as Augustine would have thought, we want to have them in order with the way things really are. We want to like the things that merit liking. We want to disapprove the things that merit disapproval. And in order to get ourselves to that state, we need to supply this check by reasoning. We can say here, I disapprove of that. I judge it negatively. But reasoning is required to find out, well, am I right to do that? Is that the right sort of response? Is that congruous with the underlying facts? Or is it something that I should realize I should revise? We do all go through a process where we sometimes, not often maybe, to that extent I think the social intuitionists are right, not often, but we at least sometimes subject our own intuitive responses to that kind of rational check. And we use that not only as a way of maybe changing our response in that particular case or reaching a different decision, but also refining our intuitions so that we develop a greater and greater ethical sensitivity. Aristotle talks about the virtuous person, not as one who reasons correctly so much, though they tend to, yes, but they develop a sensitivity. In the end, he says, the decision rests with perception. It's a matter of perceiving things in the right way. And that requires subjecting our emotional, intuitive responses to a kind of rational check and correction. Ethical thinking can be self-correcting, just as scientific thinking can be, and it consists in that sort of feedback loop that leads to a greater and greater sensitivity to ethical issues and congruity with the way things really are.